Mandapeswar Caves is one of the earliest Hindu cave temples in the Mumbai region, dedicated to Lord Shiva. It possibly was created under the rule of the Kalachuri kings, who also created the Elephanta Caves. Though only one significant sculpture remains, it is a striking depiction of Lord Shiva performing the cosmic dance. The remnants of an old Catholic college built over the cave illustrate how Portuguese trade and exploration were closely tied to a policy of religious conversion. Famed architectural historian James Fergusson, in his 1880 book, Cave Temples of India, notes that this was one of the rare instances where a Shiva temple was converted into a Roman Catholic church. He further describes how the cave became part of a large monastic establishment founded in the 16th century by Antonio de Porto. We see more details in the book series called Decades of Asia, a monumental historical work written by João de Barros, a 16th-century Portuguese historian. This series of books is one of the most significant sources documenting the Portuguese exploration and expansion in Asia during the Age of Discovery. In this book series, we see a record of the exact events surrounding this cave temple. It records as follows. There was also another pagoda on this island of Salsette, which was also carved into solid rock. In it lived a very renowned Jogi named Ratamna, along with 50 other Jogis who were sustained by the residents of the surrounding villages. When Friar Antonio do Porto heard about this pagoda, he went there, and such was his reputation among the Jogis of the island, that as soon as they saw him, they abandoned the pagoda and fled to the mainland. The friar entered the pagoda and immediately consecrated it as a church under the invocation of Our Lady of Piety. Later, it became the royal college for the entire island of Salsette, where the children of all Christians converted to the faith were gathered and educated. King Dom João granted the revenues and resources that the pagoda once possessed to sustain the Jogis over to this college. It is now administered by the Friars of the Glorious and Seraphic Father Saint Francis. The book also mentions how Friar Antonio do Porto converted many other Jogis in the surrounding regions, especially at Kanheri Caves. By the time James Fergusson documents this cave temple, about 300 years later, he notes that some of the sections had been walled off, especially the small cave containing the Shiva sculpture. He also notes that several rock sculptures seem to have been removed from the walls. The main hall here measures 51 feet by 21, with 4 pillars that are similar to the ones found at the famous Elephanta Caves. The central shrine, which probably housed a Shiva linga, was walled off at that time. Today, all the walls constructed by the Portuguese have been removed. The people of the locality have installed a Shiva linga in the central shrine, and offer worship here. The religious education institution built by the Portuguese, above the caves, is in ruins. This is now a tourist site, under the protection of the Archaeological Survey of India. The Mandapeshwar Caves is a good example to illustrate the differences in approaches between the Portuguese and British colonialists in engaging with foreign cultures. However, before we explore further, it is important to remember that these events took place centuries ago, shaped by the religious fervor of the Crusades. They should not be seen as a reflection of the values or actions of modern Portugal and Britain, whose people have no connection to these historical events. To understand the mindset of the Portuguese, one has to go back to the Holy War, called Crusades, that started in 1096 AD. This was a war waged by the Christian kingdoms of Western Europe against the Seljuk Turks who had captured the Holy Land of Jerusalem. The primary trigger for this was the call for help from the Eastern Roman Empire, capitaled at Constantinople, today's Istanbul, to send soldiers to defend their kingdom. The violent jihadist military campaign of the Turks, as well as news that they were harassing Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem, had already created anger within the Christian kingdoms. As a result, Pope Urban II organized an army of holy warriors, called Crusaders, to go liberate Jerusalem. Today's country of Portugal was founded as a kingdom in 1139 AD, during the peak of these crusades. While a holy war was being fought over Jerusalem, a parallel religious war, the Reconquista, was started to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Islamic rule. This peninsula, located in southwestern Europe, later became home to the modern countries of Portugal and Spain. The famous Templar Knights played a key role in defending and expanding this early Portuguese territory. Although the Templars were later disbanded by the Pope, their legacy continued through the organization called the Order of Christ, established in 1319. This successor organization, which was very religious in nature, became crucial to Portugal's identity and ambitions, particularly during the Age of Exploration that followed the Crusades. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks, Christendom was plunged into a serious state of stress. This event not only marked the loss of one of the two major Christian centers of power, but also the loss of control over key trade routes to India, China, and the Far East. The event had significant economic implications for Western Europe, forcing Christian nations to seek alternative sea routes to the east to bypass Ottoman-controlled territory. Portugal led this grand effort, later described as the Age of Exploration. Portuguese rulers, with their religious foundation, saw themselves as soldiers of Christ, tasked with both defending and spreading Catholicism. Amid these extraordinary events, the Pope, then the supreme authority of Christendom, granted Portugal sweeping privileges, through formal decrees such as Romanus Pontifex issued in 1455, and Intercessor issued in 1493. The Romanus Pontifex, issued by Pope Nicholas V, authorized Portugal to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Muslims and pagans and reduce them to perpetual slavery. With religious wars raging across Europe and Asia, religious conversion thus became an official mandate for the Portuguese explorers. The Portuguese found an ideal partner in the Jesuits, the influential Society of Jesus, to carry out their mission across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. While the Portuguese prioritized trade and conquest, the Jesuits played a central role in education and missionary work. Though they sometimes faced resistance, they also adapted to local cultures through syncretic practices, blending Christian teachings with indigenous traditions. The example of how this cave temple was converted into a Catholic church fits in with their general approach. In contrast, the British East India Company was a trade-focused enterprise. Its primary goal was profit, and it even avoided allowing missionaries in its territories to prevent unrest among trading partners. Only in 1813, when the company's charter was renewed, did the British Parliament force the East India Company to allow missionaries to operate. Unlike the Portuguese, whose expansion was driven by religious zeal, British colonization was rooted in Protestant pragmatism and economic interests. Unlike the Jesuits in Portugal, Britain had no singular religious order guiding its colonial strategy. Although missionary activities increased in the 1800s, religious conversion was never as central to British policy. In general, British officials and scholars were more interested in documenting and preserving aspects of India's history and culture, though these efforts were often influenced by colonial interests, and to create a narrative that subordinated Indian history and culture so as to justify British rule. Besides the Mandapeswar Caves, the famous Elephanta Caves, located near Mumbai, serve as a striking example of how the Portuguese and British dealt with cultural preservation. The Portuguese, who controlled the region in the 16th century, viewed the Hindu and Buddhist sculptures within the Elephanta Caves as pagan symbols, and defaced many of them, reportedly using the statues for target practice. This destruction has in fact been recorded by Portuguese historians. This disposition reflected the continuation of their original mission to aggressively expand Christian influence in newly encountered territories, particularly after the fall of Constantinople. This deep-rooted religious mission had fostered an intolerance toward other faiths, leading to the destruction of local heritage in several regions under their control. In contrast, when the British gained control of Elephanta Island, they approached the site with academic curiosity. Figures such as James Ferguson documented and studied the caves, helping to bring global awareness to India's architectural and cultural achievements. Though the British were primarily motivated by economic gain, and later sought to frame Indian culture as inferior, to justify their rule, their efforts in documentation and preservation ultimately benefited historical scholarship. This contrast highlights how historical context shaped the strategies of the two colonial powers in India. The Portuguese, whose national identity was forged during the Crusades, sought to conquer and convert. The British, initially driven by commercial gain, later transformed into an imperial power that used cultural documentation as a tool to legitimize their rule. However, it is important to highlight that there were also those great individuals who, despite the profit agenda of the British economic masters, did great service to shedding light on ancient Indian civilization. Some of them are Sir William Jones, founder of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, who demonstrated that Indian civilization was as advanced and ancient as any in Europe. James Prinsep, who deciphered the Brahmi script, unlocking Ashoka's edicts, and proving that India had an advanced historical record, long before colonial rule. Alexander Cunningham, who founded the Archaeological Survey of India, which played an enormous role in preserving and documenting ancient monuments and sites of India. John Marshall, who supervised the excavation of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in the 1920s, proving that Indian civilization was at least 4,500 years old. He was the one who identified the famous Indus Valley Pasupathi seal as an early prototype of the Hindu god Shiva. H. Wilson, who was the first to translate the Rig Veda into English, introducing Indian philosophy and religion to a global audience. He helped establish Indology as a serious academic field, leading to greater appreciation of Indian literary heritage. R.L. Stein, who conducted archaeological explorations in Kashmir and Central Asia, uncovering ancient Buddhist manuscripts and paintings. His work provided critical insights into ancient Indian and Buddhist cultural exchanges. Mount Stuart Elphinstone, who declined the position of viceroy in 1828 to dedicate himself to writing the history of India. As one who promoted education and legal reforms and laid the groundwork for modern Indian universities, he advocated for a more nuanced view of Indian history, avoiding excessive colonial bias. There were many others as well. Perhaps Britain's true greatness as an empire lay not in conquest, but in the contributions of individuals like these, those who prioritized knowledge, sought the truth, and ensured that history was preserved for future generations.